Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm talking about one of my very favourite authors, Jane Austen. In fact, she is my favourite author, so I'm very excited to be chatting about her books today. I thought it would be fun to rank her 6 most famous novels in order of my personal preference. So from the book of hers I like the least to the book of hers I like the most. I've been reading Jane Austen for years and years and years. I first read Pride and Prejudice when I was 9 years old. I'd watched the BBC adaptation starring Colin Firth and Jennifer Ehle, and the rest is history, as they say. I absolutely adored that adaptation. It made me want to read the book. And then as a young teenager, I went on to read all of the rest. And I've been reading them over and over and over again ever since then. And I also love listening to her books on Audible. If I don't always physically reread them, then I will listen to one of her novels almost every month. So I suppose I am a little bit obsessive, but I just absolutely adore her books. It's interesting because I think my very favourite of her books and then my least favourite of her books have always stayed the same ever since I've read all of her novels, but the ones in the middle vary quite a bit. I especially find it hard placing Sense and Sensibility and Mansfield Park in the list. My opinions tend to change every few years, but for how I'm feeling at the moment, let me share Jane Austen's novels with you in my order of personal preference. So let's get started. Okay, my least favourite Jane Austen novel is Northanger Abbey. By the way, if I haven't said this already, then I'm only doing her 6 complete novels. So I'm not talking about Lady Susan, which is a complete novel, but it's very, very slight. It's really the length of a novella. It was her earliest book and it's written in letter form. And I'm not talking about the Watsons or Sanditon, which are both unfinished novels of her. So I'm sticking to the famous 6. But of those, my least favourite is Northanger Abbey. This was one of Jane Austen's earliest works, although it was actually published after her death. Although this book was actually the first that was completed for publishing, Jane Austen was promised that it would be published, but then that promise was actually never fulfilled for Northanger Abbey, and it was actually published after her death in the end. I think you can tell that this is one of her earliest works, which is why it's my least favourite of the big 6. It's a real satire on the type of Gothic literature that was very, very popular at the time. So in Regency Britain. And Jane Austen really enjoys poking fun at that type of literature in this book, which I feel makes it less timeless. I think there are so many qualities to her other novels that make them really timeless because they're just about what it's like to be human. But I feel the point of this book is more poking fun at the Gothic novel. So it makes it, for me, a bit less timeless. And that's another reason I don't enjoy it as much. But the story follows a very young heroine called Catherine Morland, who's been brought up with a lot of love, and she's led a very sheltered existence throughout her life. Then she goes off to stay with some friends in Bath, and there she befriends a young woman called Isabella Thorpe, who becomes her best friend. Catherine's brother falls in love with Isabella, but Isabella is a real flirt, which causes some problems. Catherine herself falls in love in the book, and the hero in Northanger Abbey actually is very good. I think he is a great character. But Catherine, to me, is just rather a silly heroine. she still is a Jane Austen heroine, so there still is a lot to like about her. But she's not the brightest spark, I would say, which is a little bit unusual for Jane Austen. She normally has such intelligent heroines. Catherine, she's just so naive that sometimes she comes over as a little bit dim. And some of her sensibility, shall we say, puts her at risk of being a bit of a laughing stock, and she does make a little bit of a fool of herself in the book. She's just a little bit too romantic and a little bit too imaginative, and wants to believe that she's living her own gothic heroine life, which she isn't. But there is a very sweet ending, and yes, I still like this book. It's still a Jane Austen book, so of course I like it, but it's my least favourite. Next, there is Sense and Sensibility. So, I mean, I adore this book, but it's my second least favourite of Jane Austen's. This follows the story of Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, who are very, very close siblings. I think Jane Austen must have perhaps drawn a bit on her own very close relationship with her sister Cassandra Austen. This is one of the very, very earliest books that she wrote. It was first called Eleanor and Marianne, and she first wrote it in sort of as letters, but she rewrote it a lot over the years, so it became the third-person narrative that it is now, and she changed the title to Sense and Sensibility. So she reworked this novel a lot throughout the years, but I still think she's finding her footing. This is a much more recognisably Jane Austen novel, in my opinion, than Northanger Abbey, but she is still finding her footing in this book. And you can partly see that in the way that there are really two heroines to this. This is about both Eleanor and Marianne. I would say Eleanor is the much more traditional Jane Austen heroine. She has a lot of sense and she's very clever, whereas Marianne, who has a bit too much sensibility, again, I think Jane Austen uses her character to poke fun a little bit at the Gothic literature that was popular at the time. Marianne is far too romantic, to the point that she endangers her own health, both her physical and mental health, when she is disappointed in love. Eleanor also very much struggles when she falls in love with a man who she discovers has a secret that means he cannot reciprocate, or at least cannot acknowledge his love for her. But Eleanor deals with her heartbreak and disappointment in a very different way from Marianne. So to me, Eleanor is the true heroine of this book, but the plot is very much split between her and Marianne, and that's not something that Jane Austen did again. I mean, going forwards, there really is only one very clear heroine in her books, and I think she learnt that she preferred that after doing Sense and Sensibility. Even in Pride and Prejudice, for instance, Elizabeth Bennet has a very close relationship to her sister Jane Bennet, but Pride and Prejudice really only has one heroine, that's Elizabeth. It's really about her story. So I think Jane Austen's altered that when she went on to write Pride and Prejudice, and I think that this is a bit of a weaker novel because it isn't just Eleanor's story, or it isn't just Marianne's story. I also feel that although Marianne undergoes a huge change to her character and her understanding of the world in this book, Eleanor doesn't change a great deal. She's a very admirable character at the start of the book, and she is at the end as well. And she doesn't undergo much of a transformation, which in all of Jane Austen's other books, I think the heroines do undergo more of a transformation, or they at least gain much more self-awareness, and I think that's what makes a lot of her other novels stronger than this one. Okay, and then next is Mansfield Park. So my third least favourite Jane Austen novel. There's so much debate over Mansfield Park because a lot of people don't like the heroine, Fanny Price. And she's not such a typical Jane Austen heroine, although I think she's closer to Anne Elliot in Persuasion. But Fanny isn't the bright, light, sparkling, witty heroine that so many people love in books like Pride and Prejudice and Emma, for instance. It starts out when Fanny's just a very young girl. Her family is very poor, so she is sent to live with her mother's sister's family. Her mother's sister is Lady Bertram. She married very well and is now very wealthy. So Fanny is sent to live with the Bertrams, and she's horribly homesick, but she finds some solace from her friendship with her cousin Edmund. However, Fanny's peace is shattered when a few years down the line there are some new arrivals to the neighbourhood. Henry and Mary Crawford, sister and brother. All of the Bertrams seem to fall for the Crawfords. Edmund falls in love with Mary, and his sisters, Maria and Julia, fall in love with Henry Crawford. But Fanny is quite disapproving of them. And I think there's a lot more about morality in this book than there is in many other of Jane Austen's books. This is also a more overtly religious book, I would say, than her others. Now, I admire Fanny. A lot of people, like I say, don't like her. I really admire her because she actually, for all her timid character, she is actually a woman who knows her own mind and she sticks by her principles, which is more than could be said of a lot of the Bertrams. So if you wanted a really reliable friend, I would certainly choose Fanny, and she is tested in this book. Henry Crawford ends up falling in love with Fanny, and she has to struggle against her principles and having a more easy, comfortable, wealthy life. She has to struggle against everyone else advising her to marry Henry Crawford, and then she also has to decide whether she should marry him in order to make him a better man, and if she is wrong to refuse him when she could actually be good for him. I mean, there's so much to say about this novel. There's so much to discuss from it. It's an excellent, excellent novel. I still love it, but it doesn't top my list. Okay, and now we're getting near to the top of the list. Emma by Jane Austen is one of my very favourite novels. I love this book. I think Jane Austen wrote of Emma that she'd created a heroine that she felt no one but herself would much like. But I disagree with Jane Austen on that, and I think many people would disagree. I adore Emma, and so do many others. I love her because she has many faults, and she has to overcome her faults in this book, talking about heroines that have to undergo a lot of transformation in Jane Austen's novels. I think that Emma is possibly the best example of that. So the novel begins when Emma, who is a very rich, privileged young woman, she lives with her father on a lovely estate. She's had very little to distress or vex her in her life, but the novel begins when her beloved governess, Miss Taylor, has left Hartfield, Emma's home, to marry. So Emma is feeling a little bereft, and she befriends a young woman who is the illegitimate daughter of somebody. Nobody knows whom. It's a mystery whose Harriet father was, who her true heritage in fact was. So Emma befriends Harriet Smith, and she builds up a bit of a fantasy around Harriet, thinking that perhaps she's the illegitimate daughter of aristocracy or something. Anyway, Emma is very convinced that she knows what's best for everybody else around her, and she decides to be a matchmaker and to find Harriet a husband. This is a very funny book. all of Emma's plans go awry throughout the course of the novel, and it could so easily all tip into disaster. But fortunately, things come out all right in the end. I love this book. I love Emma. I love Mr. Knightley, Harriet Smith even, Mrs. Bates, Miss Bates. There are so many wonderful characters, wonderful lines from this book. Like I said, I love too how much growth Emma undergoes throughout the book, from really being quite a vain, not personally vain as Mr. Knightley says, but definitely vain in terms of thinking that she is always right and always knows best. So really from being quite arrogant, Emma learns humility, and she also learns how to love, and she also learns to be less of a snob, because she is quite a snob in the book as well. And she learns to overcome that and really become a better person by the end of this book. So yes, I love Emma. Okay, and now getting right towards the top. So my second very favourite Jane Austen novel is Pride and Prejudice. I mean, what a classic. Who cannot love Pride and Prejudice? Who cannot love Elizabeth Bennet? She is my very favourite heroine. She is just sparkling. I mean, if I could be like anyone, I would love to be like Lizzie. She is the sort of person who is never at a loss for words. Mr. Darcy, the love interest, is charmed by her wit, and everyone else is charmed by Lizzie's wit as well. She's such a good-humoured person too. She also has to learn more about herself throughout the novel before she can have her happy ending, and she has to learn to be a little less opinionated, a little less prejudiced, to look a little deeper, and also to be more understanding of others who perhaps aren't quite like herself. But she's my very favourite heroine out of all fiction, so of course I adore Pride and Prejudice. And then I feel like I should have a little drum roll or something, but my all-time favourite Jane Austen book is Persuasion. That won't come as a surprise to a lot of people, because I have spoken so many times about how much I adore Persuasion. It is my very favourite Jane Austen book. You can tell what a mature writer she is by this point, I feel. It's one of her slimmest books, but it's just packed full of so much. Anne Elliot, I mean, I've just said that Lizzie Bennet is my favourite heroine, but I mean, Anne Elliot is right up there too. She is wonderful. She's a little bit older than most of Jane Austen's heroines. She's 27, and having been persuaded to refuse the offer of marriage from the love of her life when she was a very young girl, she now thinks that she will never marry and will never find love again. And at 27, she's very much in danger of becoming an old maid. So when she was young, she refused Captain Wentworth because Lady Russell, who sort of stands in place as Anne's mother, because Anne's mother died when she was very young, thinks that he is not wealthy, not good enough for Anne. But years down the road, Captain Wentworth comes back into Anne's life, and she goes through very many painful moments in meeting him again, in hearing that he thinks that she is altered beyond recognition, in feeling that he doesn't love her anymore, that he's in fact still very angry with her, and that he will marry someone else. This is my favourite love story. There's just so much to enjoy about this novel. There are so many classic scenes from it as well. Anne learns to be less persuadable through the book. She learns to understand the motivation of others better as well as herself. But she's just such a mature, admirable character. She is pure gold. So Yes, between Elizabeth Bennet and Anne Elliot, I don't know if I could actually pick because they're both wonderful. And I think it's the blend of sadness mixed with joy that makes this such a poignant novel for me and makes it my very, very favourite Jane Austen book. I actually just reread this one this month, actually, in February, and yes, it was a delight to read it again. But anyway, those are the Jane Austen novels ranked in my order of preference. I would love to hear your views. Which is your all-time favourite Jane Austen novel? Which is your least favourite? What do you think about all of these books? I'd love to know. But thank you so much for watching. Do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And I'll be back again very soon with another video. Bye!